Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And a lot of news we have. Of course, the death at age 91 of Mikhail Gorbachev, revered in the West, reviled in Russia and other places. We'll have a look back at his lasting legacy. Then we'll take a look at the latest debate in the European Union about whether to bar Russian visitors from visiting the European Union. We'll examine what will happen once Liz Truss, who will presumably be elected as the new leader of the Conservative Party, becomes Prime Minister of Britain, and what it means for global Britain. And finally, in Iraq, the place in which the surge back in the late 2000s and late aughts, as we say, was supposed to solve all political problems. We had violence of a scale we hadn't seen for quite a while because of political differences. Here to discuss all of this is Caroline de Gruyter, who is a correspondent with the NRC Handelsblad, and she's joining us from Brussels. Caroline, nice to see you again.
Nice to be on the show again.
Gideon Rachman, who is the chief foreign affairs commentator at the Financial Times. Gideon, great to see you as well.
Nice to be here.
And returning after an absence, Prashant Rao, who is now a senior editor at Semaphore. Prashant is I believe in New York. No, he's not in New York.
London.
But great to see you. Great to see you here as well, Prashant. Let's start, which of course is the biggest story in some ways of the week. It's the death of Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gideon, a man with an extraordinary imprint on the last century, with lasting implications even for today. Few people have had as much import, certainly in the few years that he was actually in power as Mikhail Gorbachev. He died at the good old age of 91, quietly over in Moscow. What went through your mind when you heard the news? What did you recall? What were the big issues that you immediately gravitated to as you heard that news?
Well, I suppose I recall the fact that, I was fortunate enough my first ever visit to Moscow was during the early Gorbachev years, and some of the excitement of that time, because, I joined the BBC World Service, my first ever journalistic job in '84, when the Cold War was, as it was still rumbling along. And then suddenly, you had this new Soviet Union leader. Some people say, well, maybe he could be a bit different, but mainly people are skeptical. And then you suddenly realize, oh my goodness, things are really changing. They're allowing freedom of speech. That first visit I was there, I remember visiting the foreign correspondents, and the story they were all covering was the opening of the first private restaurants in Moscow. There were like 2 or 3. It was a bleak, depressing place. The economy was visibly failing, and in a sense that was what Gorbachev was reacting to. He said, he realized the absurdities that they'd got to when there was a committee set up to look into the shortage of women's pantyhose. This was a society and an economy that was failing, and he was determined to shake it up through economic reconstruction, but also through political change. And this excitement that people could say what they wanted, and so on. And then the international impact. Firstly, the fact that improbably he and Ronald Reagan, the Cold Warrior par excellence, form this relationship and begin to dial down the Cold War, breakthroughs in arms controls. And then, of course, things get out of control in ways that Gorbachev had not perhaps anticipated. The risings in Eastern Europe, in East Berlin, in Hungary and other places. And his reaction, which is, I think, why he will be remembered really as a great man, I think, although not many Russians might agree, because his refusal to react in the traditional Soviet way and send in the tanks, which is what the Russians had done in '56, in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia in '68. And indeed, he was almost indirectly provocateur of what happened, because he visits East Berlin, and I think in October '89, and the crowds are chanting, Gorby, save us. And Honecker, the East German leader, is discomforted, and the East German crowds are looking to Gorbachev as a liberator, and he tells Honecker to move with the times and so on, and the Berlin Wall falls a month later. Now, unfortunately, he's remembered by the people who are currently in power in Russia, Putin, etc. They regard that as a great betrayal, and indeed, in Putin's memoirs, he was, ironically enough, a KGB officer in East Germany in '89 at that precise point, and he calls Russia for instructions. What should I do? And he records with despair, Moscow was silent. And I think, in a weird way, it's sort of fitting, ironic, whatever you want to call it, that Gorbachev should die in the very year that Putin finally moved to do the final repudiation of the Gorbachev legacy by once again sending the tanks in to try to reclaim Ukraine, which, because it was not just the Soviet Empire that was lost, but eventually the Soviet Union itself with its dissolution at the end of '91.
Gideon, a wonderful summation, I think, of the man and his impact. Caroline, pick up on sort of this last point, because we, of course, in the West remember not just particularly the breakup of the Soviet Empire and the freedom to Central and Eastern Europe and the emergence of a Europe that was whole, free, and at peace. Many in Russia remember not that, but the breakup of the Russian Empire, the breakup of the Soviet Union itself. And a lot of people in the newly independent republics, not just in Ukraine, recall Gorbachev not as a man of peace or a man of openness, but a man who violently tried to repress the very independence that he was granting through his actions to countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And how in the Baltic states in particular, how to reconcile those two fundamental differences, which are living in the European Union today with 3 Baltic states that are just as independent and just as free, but certainly don't look at Gorbachev in the same way as the Poles or others.
I think, yes, I think there is a lot of ambiguity about him. Somebody actually, I can't remember where I read this week, but somebody was comparing him as a visionary who was blind. So he knew change was on the way, things had to be done differently, and he wanted to do it, but he didn't know what he was doing, really. Like Columbus discovering America without realizing where he was. For me, I think this ambiguity is really something I remember him for. I was working on a book a little while ago about what the EU can learn from the Habsburg Empire. And then for that book, I read thousands of pages of interviews and letters with Otto von Habsburg, the son of the last Habsburg emperor. And in a French book, Otto tells his interviewer that he was, he supported independence activists in the Baltic states, and he was actually there in 1990 when the Soviet Union was crumbling. He was in Lithuania to support these activists, and he describes how they were completely surrounded by Soviet troops, and suddenly all these troops disappeared. They just evaporated, they vanished. And that was very strange. So they continued their visit. And later on, he asked the former commander of the Soviet Air Force, a certain General Dudayev, I believe a Chechnyan, from Chechnya, who was very sympathetic always to the Baltics. And this general told Otto, yes, I know what happened on that particular day in the 1990s. Gorbachev, exactly on the day that you, Otto, were in Lithuania, he sent me a telegram ordering me to bomb flat all 3 Baltic capitals. But I didn't do it. I threw the telegram in the bin. But funnily enough, I was never punished for ignoring the decree. And I think this is, we cannot ask Dudayev if he confirms that story or not, he was murdered by the Russians. But I think this is typical of the Gorbachev legacy, that he did, if the story is true, he did order the destruction of the 3 Baltic capitals. But since he had no control any longer, that was sort of fine for him too, Nothing came of it. Dudayev was never punished for it. And I think we can only hope for some Dudayev-like characters in the Russian Air Force now.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't see a lot of them as yet, and perhaps because Vladimir Putin is a little tougher with those who disagree with him than Mikhail Gorbachev ever was. But a wonderful story, and sort of this blind visionary just shows up in this story as well. Prashant, not everyone in Russia, but not everyone in the world looked back to Gorbachev as sort of the man to follow to his logical end. Thinking of someone sitting in Beijing right now trying to figure out how he can avoid the fate of Gorbachev and that China can avoid the fate of the Soviet Union. Certainly the Chinese learned very, very different lessons from his tenure than many others, certainly in the West.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the interesting things about Gorbachev today is that, we obviously a lot of our thoughts are with the legacy of Ukraine as it stands. But, Xi Jinping in 2013 called the collapse of the Soviet Union a cautionary tale. In a speech that year, he said, all it took was one quiet word from Gorbachev to declare the dissolution of the Soviet Communist Party, and a great party was gone. In the end, nobody was a real man. Nobody came out to resist. And this is a really foundational sort of thought that people often go back to with Xi. I mean, it was almost a decade ago that he said this, but it really speaks to how he believes China should, or in fact shouldn't, reform, and the centrality of the party to the Chinese state. And it's fascinating how this legacy, obviously extends into Europe, and we've talked about that, but the power of the Soviet Union and the reach of the Soviet Union makes it logical that there were lessons learned in Asia as well from all of the things that Gorbachev did. The one thing I did want to sort of come back to, I'm curious, the other people on this call, on this sort of program, are much more experienced on this than me, but it's fascinating to me that I feel like often when we talk about great leaders, we talk about them almost in a vacuum, and how Putin has tried to reverse Gorbachev. It's not a perfect comparison, but it makes me think of how we often thought that Trump just wanted to reverse Obama, and the fact that these presidents and these leaders who come, they don't step into this kind of moment where they are often trying to undo the work of their predecessors, and I just find that fascinating that in this history that we look at, these leaders, they are doing things, but they're also so saddled with the baggage that their predecessors have handed them. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, in that case, in the case of Gorbachev, of course, he had all these leaders preceding him who were dying on him. One of them older than the others, and I think one of the interesting things is what a masterful, in some ways, politician he was within the Soviet system to rise as quickly as he did. He was I think the youngest general secretary since Stalin of the Communist Party, and then, of course, abandoned being general secretary and became president of the Soviet Union. But very quickly got rid of all the old people. The one who had nominated him, Andrei Gromyko, a longtime foreign minister, was moved upstairs to the presidium of the Soviet Union, which meant nothing other than a titular head. And he surrounded himself with all these young, new, reform-minded people, Shevardnadze and so many others, in order to change the country. But then it changed so quickly that he didn't know how to control it, which is presumably what Xi Jinping is so worried about. And so better not open the funnel, because you don't know how much will stream out of it.
Gideon. I mean, I think that the critical about this blind visionary. I mean, I think that once he had started, in a way, they understood that they weren't in control, that they were having to make things up as they went along. And it was a strange period where Western leaders would often say how incredibly interesting their conversations with the Russians were. Not something you normally would say when you met a Russian leader. But, Thatcher, I was just reading up an account of Thatcher's first meeting with Gorbachev, and they spoke for hours, and they argued, because Thatcher, that was what she was like. She gave him a lecture on how terrible communism was, but he kind of argued back. And again, I mentioned that first trip of mine to Moscow. I remember George Shultz I was following an American delegation. George Shultz was Secretary of State, and he had a conversation with the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, who was an economist, about reforming the Soviet economy. And Shultz said, that was the most fascinating conversation, 3 hours of trying to figure out, what do you do? And it was interesting for everybody that, and in a way, a strangely kind of fraternal phrase where they weren't sort of at each other's throats. There was a sense that they could learn from each other. But yeah, that didn't last. And just a last couple of thoughts is, among the people who think that Gorbachev was a dupe and an idiot, even at the time, was Donald Trump. I mean, if you read that famous Playboy interview that Donald Trump gave in 1990, in it he says, I've just been to Moscow, and everyone says Gorbachev's this great guy. He's a complete idiot. The Soviet Union's going to fall apart. So he had a sort of Putinist view of, what are you doing? You're destroying the system.
The great insight of that great analyst of Soviet affairs.
Absolutely. I'm afraid he sort of had a point on that one. I'm not. If you strip aside any moral considerations, he was sort of had a sense of the way things were going.
Gideon is right about these interesting conversations. We had in my newspaper this week, all of a sudden somebody wrote a story about personal correspondence between Ruud Lubbers, who used to be prime minister for a long time, and Gorbachev about nuclear missiles that NATO wanted to put in the Netherlands, and the population was completely against. So Lubbers was in total bind. He was very much a NATO man, but at the same time, he tried to negotiate his way out of it by writing letters, long letters about this dilemma to Gorbachev, and Gorbachev would reply. Incredible, huh? And this went on for years. And in the end, Lubbers never got Gorbachev to do what he wanted, take some steps so that Lubbers could tell NATO, well, there's no need for the missiles any longer. So he took the painful decision in the end that the missiles had to be installed. But before they could get there, Russia and the US signed the famous agreement. So they never arrived.
Yeah, no, the famous
extraordinary.
No, it was a different time, and although we now have letters between leaders too, very famous letters, love letters at times between
in big envelopes.
Yeah, big envelopes. Yeah.
So we do have letters. One final point before we move on is we remember the transformative nature of Gorbachev and the meaning thereof. But there was a lot of skepticism about the degree to which it was real. Margaret Thatcher in that first meeting came out and said, we can do business with this man, which was a big difference. But even in 1989, when George H.W. Bush had become president, there were people in his administration, not least his defense secretary, Dick Cheney, and his national security advisor and deputy national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft and Bob Gates, who thought this was all a ruse, that it was not real, that it wasn't part of what would happen. George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, as we like to call him, was sort of on the fence until really the summit meeting they had in Malta, the famous meeting on aboard these ships in the gales that were difficult to deal with, and they finally said, this guy is really for real, and we need to help him, to the point that they try to keep the Soviet Union together.
Yeah, he was skeptical about Ukrainian independence.
He was very skeptical. What William Safire called the chicken Kiev speech.
Yeah.
A speech in Kiev by George Bush saying, don't push for independence too quickly because you don't know what may happen. A fascinating, really fascinating time, which by the way, I think would not have been possible but for the insight, the visions, and the courage of Mikhail Gorbachev. We certainly can use leaders like that everywhere these days, even if we don't necessarily know the results that come off of. But there was a sense of decency about what it meant to be a leader of a country that at times we are missing. Let's move on because I think we could probably spend the entire 45 minutes, and we've already done most of it, half of it on this. Quickly get to the three other topics that I think are important for people to realize. Caroline, in I believe it was in Prague this week, the foreign ministers got together of the European Union to deal with a really, really tricky issue. Should European governments allow Russians to visit, to be tourists, to do what Russian visitors have long been able to do in the European Union, come in quite easily and quickly. And then, of course, once you're in a Schengen country, move about like everyone else without further controls. Big divisions within the European Union that I think remain, but at least for now, there is a resolution of sorts in a typical EU fashion to resolve this. Bring us up to date about what the issues are and how it was resolved.
Yeah, they resolved it more or less for now, but as you say, this is typical. You know, one camp wants A and the other camp wants B, and then they sort of end up in the middle for now, and then kick the can down the road for further decisions later. So what they didn't introduce a visa ban, but they tightened visa policy right now. So what they did is they decided to suspend a visa facilitation agreement, as they call it, that the EU had with Moscow since 2007, I believe. And so this process is not going to be blocked entirely, but it will take longer. People will have to show up with more documents. They will get more questions also about what they think of the war and that kind of thing, the war in Ukraine. And it will also be more expensive for Russians because they had a special discount price till now. But so, yeah, they stopped short of an all-out visa ban that some member states, especially those bordering Russia or almost bordering Russia, had called for. Since the invasion in February in Ukraine, almost 1 million Russians came to the EU. And since there's a flight ban to and from Russia, they mostly came over land. And so it is the Baltic states and Poland and Finland and a few more that got them all, especially Finland, I think. So they had trouble checking identities, checking papers, and quite a few spies, of course, were found. And as you said, in the Schengen area, even a Russian with a Spanish or a French visa has to be allowed in at the Finnish-Russian border. So these countries simply got fed up. And moreover, Instagram and Twitter were full of quite rich posts of partying Russians, some close to the Kremlin, smashing plates in a taverna in Greece, or shopping at Dior in Paris. So politicians, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, they said, this is not fair, you know. Well, at the same time, Ukrainians are being killed in their name. So these member states wanted a total ban, but others, they said, hey, we can't lock up all the Russians because that would be a new Iron Curtain in a way, but this time imposed by the West. So we should block criminals, we should block people on the sanctions list, people close to Putin. I believe some supporters of opposition leader Navalny, the man who's in jail, they already composed a list with 6,000 people who should be excluded and begging the EU to let the rest all in easily. Because it's the opposition in Russia that is now trapped, and that must be helped, especially in this stage of the war. So, and I think I quite agree with that. I think these people should be able to come to Europe. We should give them refuge much more easily than we do now. We help the Ukrainians, but we don't do enough for the Russian opposition. And moreover, Putin will hate it. He will hate to see ordinary Russians watching the BBC, watching CNN programs, studying at European universities like LSE or the Sorbonne. Or LSE, maybe that's not EU business anymore, but Berlin University. Putin will hate to see them enjoying the pluralist society where you don't get locked up for 15 years simply because you oppose Putin's war in Ukraine. And he will hate to see them discover the terrible truth about Bucha and all the other atrocities in Ukraine. So I would love it if Europe would start a huge Fulbright kind of program, not only for Russians, by the way, also for people in Belarus. Values and openness, that is, I think, what we are. And if we think that we have a better system, well, let's start to use it much better as a geopolitical tool. The EU doesn't have many weapons, so this could be a powerful one. It could be great.
Caroline, I think that's you summed it up nicely, and I think that the last point you make is sort of gets you back to this very fundamental debate that we always have about whether openness or closeness is a better way to undermine the regime that we're trying to deal with, whether it's Russia or China or what have you. Gideon, where do you see that debate? What's your perspective on the debate, but also where do you think it's going?
Well, I'm sorry to be wishy-washy, but I'm sort of ambivalent about it. I can understand both arguments, and so maybe the messy compromise is right, that you've got to make it harder. I think that there is something upsetting if you're a Ukrainian to see rich Russians sort of partying on the Côte d'Azur. It's not written. It's not right. But equally, to close ourselves off, I think is a mistake. And there are, as Caroline was saying, 1 million Russians have left. I mean, not all of them refugees, but a substantial proportion of them. And their fate, unluckily for them, is relatively low down the list of problems we're dealing with at the moment. But some of them are in pretty difficult situations. Their money's frozen. They can't go home. They don't have jobs. And in time, they too need to be treated with a degree of compassion, I think.
Prashant, you've been living in London for a while, and plenty of Russians used to cavort and party there as well. And yet we also, London, like other places, a refuge for people whose views are being repressed in other places. How do you look at this balance between openness and closeness that is playing out?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'd come down sort of where Gideon does, which is just this is really at the heart of the liberal dilemma, right? I mean, I'm actually an alum of the LSE, and so I'm very familiar with sort of dictators sending their kids to my alma mater to launder their reputation. And so I'm a little skeptical of this notion that
you mean like Gaddafi?
Gaddafi, Mugabe, there's a lot of people who sent sort of like their scions to the LSE and comparable universities. And so, the Libyan government sent sort of civil servants to the LSE to get sort of executive education training, all this kind of thing. But, so I'm a little skeptical of the notion that sort of exposing people in autocracies to Western ways of life helps. I actually don't think that works anymore. Xi Jinping's daughter went to Harvard. Xi Jinping in the 1980s spent some time in Iowa. I think we over-index on the stories of what was it like? Yeltsin went to the supermarket and was like, "Oh yeah, if Soviets saw this, the whole system will collapse." And we over-index on those examples because we suffer from as a community. In sort of free societies, we see well, of course, our way of life is the right way, and once people see that, they'll come around to it. But we have plenty of evidence that's not true, because in 1984, when the sort of Sino-British handover was signed between Hong Kong to hand Hong Kong over to China, I think any reasonable person would have assumed that China would become more like Hong Kong and not the other way around. And that of the three, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China, Taiwan was the least likely to become a democracy. And yet, we see what we have now. So I actually, sometimes I think we think too much about this, for one, that this is something of a sideshow to the central kind of question of what is happening in Ukraine. But secondarily, I don't think exposing people in sort of particularly kind of autocratic true believers to free societies in the modern era helps, because they already have their parallel modes of information. It's not like they'll come here and then read The Guardian and be like, oh yeah, Putin was a dictator. I don't know why I didn't see that.
And indeed, isn't one of the biggest propagandists, on Russian television, this guy Salyalov, had a villa in Lake Como. But,
I think this is the difficulty I have with this kind of question is I just don't think exposing people to free societies makes them feel like free people. I think they to a large extent, our universities and Western societies begin to launder the reputations of people who, live and benefit from autocracies.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and at the same time, there is, I think, as Caroline rightly said, the Russian opposition itself is very much hoping that there can be some differentiation in who's allowed and who's to come, and perhaps the ones that should be banned are the sons and daughters of the dictators and the oligarchs and everything else. Voilà. But the relatively, the people who just want to get on with life. And they may, in fact, be more exposed. Certainly, that would be the good old Ostpolitik, the change through engagement kind of approach. So, Caroline, last word to you before we jump to the next issue.
Whatever you decide, there's always a group of Russians that it doesn't apply to. So if you decide to let everybody in, people will say, hey, all these oligarchs in the West, they haven't learned anything and they're backing Putin, so it doesn't work. Yeah, for them it doesn't work, but for some others it does. And what I would like, at the moment, a friend of mine is a lawyer and she works with refugees in Paris. And she says there are lots of, for instance, just a small example, mixed couples, Ukrainian, Russian. Mm-hmm. To get the Ukrainian in is a piece of cake. In that Europe was very fast to get status immediately. Within a few weeks, they have an ID card, even in Belgium, which is always slow with everything. But the Russian part of the couple, even if they're married and if they have been living in Ukraine for many years, even if he or she is totally against the war, can hardly be gotten in on a legal basis. We don't have the tools. Moreover, a lot of consulates and embassies in Russia, they've seen their diplomats kicked out. So I know, for instance, the Dutch embassy is not giving anyone, whether opposition or oligarch or anything in between, which is mostly what we're talking about, visa any longer because they don't have the personnel. So only in very urgent humanitarian cases we do something. I think this is wrong. I think we should be much more active and help ordinary people. That's all I'm saying. But yes, let's try to weed out the bad guys. I'm all for it.
And that's where the trick comes. It's so much easier to do all or nothing. It's when you have to act like a thief that. And
the FSB spies, they will come anyway on false papers.
They're already here.
That's what they're good at. They're already here.
Yes, exactly. Gideon, let's thanks. Let's take a quick look at Liz Truss, who has positioned herself as a true believer in the West and in liberalism, in some form of small L liberalism, and a leader in this movement. I'm sure she will be a major player on this and many other issues, or will she just have to deal with the new problems that the Prime Minister of Britain is likely to face, like skyrocketing inflation, energy costs, electricity issues, the National Health Service, and everything else that a Prime Minister spends 95% of their time on when they are actually in office? what's she going to face and how's she going to deal with it, I guess, is the big issue.
Well, you're right. She is a true believer on Ukraine and so on, and almost in a kind of Reaganite way, very preoccupied by freedom as a concept that's central to her political views, or at least the way she chooses to project herself politically. I mean, she even called her daughter Liberty. So, there you go. But and I think that one time I've had the chance to discuss Ukraine with her, in her role as foreign secretary. This was actually just before the war. She was, put it this way, on the hard line edge of things. And I think to the extent that I picked up some concern in Washington where they were taking more seriously the threat of nuclear war, frankly, that Truss might be a little bit extreme even for them, that she was one of the first, for example, to start talking about liberating Crimea as well. And I think that some thought, do we necessarily want to poke them on that one? Maybe she'll be vindicated by history, but that's certainly where she comes from. And, you're right. She has this utterly intimidating in-trade domestically, soaring inflation, an energy crunch, a food price crunch, strikes to come, the country running out of money. It's all very 1970s. And she appears to be, again, playing from the sort of what she regards as the sort of Thatcherite Reaganite playbook in saying, the solution is tax cuts. And many economists think that's not going to work. That's, when people want subsidies to their energy bills, it's a very indirect way to cut their VAT. And also, the government's going to need revenue, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some question about how realistic she is about all that. But I think, it was interesting in the last kind of dog days of the Johnson administration, one got the impression that he was actually happier in Kiev than in London, because in Kiev he could sort of stroll the streets and people cheered him, and he was a kind of moral issue, and he could be out there, up front, and then back home everybody hated him. Whereas, and I think
sort of a Gorbachev.
Very Gorbachev, and I wonder whether Liz Truss may do the same. That she'll prefer the sort of relatively simple task of standing up for liberty overseas, and Britain has played a relatively important role, in supplying advanced weaponry, training Ukrainian troops, that kind of thing. There's some training over here right at the moment, to the bit of a nightmare that's going to face her domestically. But she knows that she stands or falls politically not by what she does in Ukraine, but by what she does with the economy. But I'll be interested to hear from Prashant, who's I gather living amongst us. What do you think of this strange new prime minister we're going to have?
It's fascinating because Truss is so doctrinaire. I was at the Atlantic just before Semaphore, and one of our writers spent some time with Truss and wrote a profile of her. And she is. It's almost as though she's playing the part of a true believer. It is so on message constantly that I do wonder, whether her politics are ready for, as Gideon says, this astonishingly difficult in-trade that she has domestically. It is. You can be a fiscal hawk all you want, but when the winter comes in Britain, and there's talk of brownouts, there's talk of there's several pubs now that say they won't be able to open because their energy bills aren't capped the way consumers' prices are capped. Food banks
are really serious as the pubs can't open.
I know. It's honestly terrible. But in all seriousness, food banks are saying that they can't stay open because they won't be able to pay their energy costs. So it's going to be really interesting when the rubber hits the road in that kind of cliched sense that, it's very easy, as Gideon says, to stand up for freedom, Ukraine. And, I think sort of that is almost a costless decision from a rhetorical point of view. And of course, Britain has put a lot of skin in the game, to its credit. But domestically now, the idea that Britain can go and not have some kind of subsidy or handout is, I think, she's trying to say this, but so much of this is, it's not dissimilar to the American primary system in that you start speaking to the true believers, and so you have to go hard on your party's line because those are the people you have to win over. But you're talking to a selectorate, not the electorate, and that becomes a real problem because you box yourself in. much like happens in the United States presidential system, where when you're talking only to Republicans, the views get further and further to the extremes. And I think that's what we're seeing here. These are two Tory candidates who are now, fighting once again, as has happened, 2-3 times in the past, sort of 5 years, among Tory paid members to determine the future of this country. And I think it's going to be, the next 3 months in Britain will be very difficult. Ukraine will be a cinch for Liz Truss compared to the domestic challenges she has.
Yeah. And there are remarkably few of these Tory members. I mean, it's like 120,000 people. And you don't even have to be a British citizen to be a Tory member. So, if I was the FSB, I would have been bulk buying Tory membership for a while. Yeah.
And maybe that's part of the 120,000.
Exactly.
Who knows? So,
Caroline, residency.
Caroline, one sort of interesting thing. It's true, she's very doctrinaire, but she's also evolved from being a quite left-wing, early, in college times person to now a more Thatcher than Thatcher kind of conservative, and that does suggest that maybe her views aren't as strongly held as
but there's also the sort of the certainty of the zealot is always terrifying as well. The convert is always the most zealot.
True. The reality of power may also lead to
and the temptation to change. I mean, Eva, sorry to interrupt, but one of the best speeches I've seen saying why it would be a disaster if Britain left the EU.
Oh, that's
given by Liz Truss.
Right. Of course, she was a Remainer. Yeah,
what was going to happen?
Yeah,
and gave a very, very clear explanation of what a nightmare it would be. And yet now she's saying I was wrong. It's more. So you have to question how much she believes in anything, really.
Yeah. And now she has to be elected by the hard Brexiteers. So that's the people she's catering to, and from where I sit in Brussels, and in many European capitals, they see that, and this is how the whole Brexit story started in the first place, with a small group of vocal anti-European backbenchers, and that David Cameron wanted to silence once and for all by holding this referendum, thinking he would win it with some concessions. He got some concessions and he lost the referendum. And still these backbenchers are the ones who are in a way determining the relationship between the UK and the EU. So I think people are rather, it's this small group that you were just talking about. Nothing has moved, so they're strapping themselves in here for some rough times.
Well, so I mean, that does suggest that when she takes over, her she's facing a three-front war, perhaps. One with the European Union, where she has also laid out a very strong sense that she wants to revisit the North Ireland Protocol, which is at the core of the Brexit agreement with the European Union. And if she thinks that she can turn the European Union in ways that none of her predecessors have been able to do, then she probably will have a wake-up call there. I think, Gideon, you rightly said that I think there's deep skepticism about her in the United States and in the administration. Your paper had a very good piece on her first visit to Washington, in which she told Blinken, "Well, we don't think there's anything special about the relationship," which usually is what the Americans say, and not the Brits. But that was kind of interesting. Sort of, what have you done for me lately? By the way, she then went out and declared that we should have a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, but it wasn't clear what the British financial contribution would be to that compared to the EU and US contribution. But that's a different matter. And of course, then she has home and everything that's waiting her that Prashant talked about. This is in normal times, this may not be the best time to become a new prime minister in Britain. And I guess the polls, they're 12 points behind now, the Conservatives, behind Labour. The polls aren't particularly good for an elected term. So tough times.
Oh, and Boris Johnson lurking in the background.
And Boris Johnson won't go away. Yes, yeah, and ask Joe Biden how that feels.
Yeah.
So a tough set of issues to follow. We didn't get to Iraq. We will do that another time. Prashant, you've been saved. Although the situation there bears watching. For the very least, it's complicated, but shows that the turmoil that has beset the country since not only the U.S. invasion, but before, continues in one form or another. In the meantime, I want to thank Prashant Rao, Caroline Gruyter, and Gideon Rachman for an insightful session on so many different issues. We'll look next week. Actually, next week we're going to take a break just for our regular listeners. We'll have another show that you can watch on China. But we'll be back in the weeks ahead to talk all about this with all of you. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. And we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time with another edition of World Review. Until then, bon weekend.